Ever feel like you're being subtly nudged by unseen forces?
It's like those "you are being watched" signs, even without a camera, they make you behave, right?
Well, Michel Foucault wants to talk about that feeling.
Today, we're diving into the mind of this powerhouse thinker to uncover how power operates in our everyday lives.
Forget kings and crowns. We're going deeper, looking at prisons, schools, even how we talk about things, to see power's sneaky fingerprints everywhere.
Foucault is a master at dissecting the mundane.
Take prisons, for example.
Most people see them as places of punishment, but Foucault saw them as laboratories of power.
He argued that they are designed not just to lock people up, but to shape their behavior in a very specific way.
So, more like behavior modification centers than just concrete boxes with bars.
Exactly. Foucault pointed to the Panopticon, a prison design where cells are arranged around a central watchtower.
Prisoners can't see inside the tower, so they never know if they're being watched.
This constant potential for observation, Foucault argued, creates a powerful sense of self-discipline.
It's like always assuming there's a camera on you, even when there might not be.
And that's where it gets really interesting, this idea that we internalize these systems of control.
It's not just about being watched, it's about feeling watched and then changing how we act because of it.
Precisely. Think about how social media plays on this.
We might censor ourselves or project a certain image online because we're aware of the potential for scrutiny.
This self-monitoring, Foucault would argue, is a direct result of what he called disciplinary power, a force that shapes our actions by playing on our awareness of being observed or potentially observed. Okay, so we've gone from prisons to Instagram in a matter of minutes, proof that Foucault's ideas are anything but irrelevant.
But how does knowledge fit into all of this?
It seems like a bit of a leap, but I'm guessing he saw a connection between power and what we believe to be true.
Absolutely.
Foucault argued that knowledge isn't just some neutral reflection of reality.
It's actually a tool of power.
He believed that the way we talk about things, the categories we use, even the questions we ask, are all shaped by power relations.
He called this web of language and categorization discourse, and argued that it plays a powerful role in shaping what we think and how we act.
Can you give me a concrete example of that?
How can something as simple as language be a tool of power? Let's take how we talk about crime.
Instead of simply describing acts, we label people as criminals, deviants, even dangerous.
Foucault argued these labels aren't objective truths, but tools used to justify the justice system's authority.
So it's like the system creates the very language it uses to control people. Define someone as a criminal, and suddenly any action they take can be viewed through that lens, justifying stricter laws, more surveillance, that kind of thing.
Precisely.
This is what Foucault called criminological discourse. It's not about finding truth, but about controlling the narrative around crime to increase the system's own power. Okay, that is seriously making me rethink everything I thought I knew about, well, knowledge itself.
This discourse thing is everywhere once you start looking for it.
But where does sexuality fit into all of this?
It seems like a bit of a jump from prisons and language, but knowing Foucault, I'm sure there's a method to his madness. You're right to trust there's a method.
Foucault argued that even something as seemingly personal as sexuality is shaped by power structures.
He claimed the very idea of sexuality is a modern invention, a product of how power operates rather than some natural inherent thing.
Wait, he's saying that sexuality is a construct?
That's a pretty bold claim.
How did he even arrive at that?
He traced it back to the practices of the Christian church.
The church's obsession with confession, particularly about sexual desires, put a huge focus on this area of life.
This, Foucault argued, created a framework for controlling people by making them scrutinize and regulate their own desires.
So the very act of trying to repress sexuality by making people confess and categorize their desires actually brought it into sharper focus and inadvertently created the thing it was trying to control. And this focus on sexuality didn't disappear with the decline of the church.
It was taken up by other institutions, science, medicine, psychology, each with their own ways of defining and categorizing what was normal and abnormal when it came to sex.
So it's like this idea of sexuality became a moving target.
Every time one authority loosened its grip, another was ready to grab hold and exert its own form of control.
Precisely.
Foucault wants us to see how these categories, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, aren't neutral descriptions. They're tools that can be used to control and categorize people.
This is all starting to feel very mind-blowing.
We've gone from prisons to knowledge to sexuality, And in each one, Foucault sees this web of power operating in subtle, often invisible ways.
And he doesn't stop there.
Foucault also challenges the traditional role of intellectuals in all of this.
He believed they have a responsibility to do more than just observe and analyze.
They should actively challenge power structures and seek alternative ways of understanding the world.
So instead of just being academics in ivory towers, intellectuals should be more like, what? Activists. Revolutionaries.
It's not necessarily about storming the barricades, though it could be.
Foucault argued against the idea of the universal intellectual, someone who claims to have all the answers and speaks for everyone.
He believed that true intellectual work comes from being embedded in specific social contexts and using that knowledge to challenge the power dynamics at play.
So more like specialized investigators, each working to uncover the hidden workings of power in their own fields.
Exactly. He called these specific intellectuals.
They could be academics, journalists, artists, anyone who uses their platform to question assumptions, expose injustice, and give voice to those who are often silenced. So it's about using knowledge to empower others, not just to amass it for yourself.
It's making me rethink the whole purpose of intellectual work.
Instead of just seeking truth, it's about using knowledge to create a more just world.
That's the heart of Foucault's message.
He wants us to see that knowledge is power, and that power can be used for good or ill. Okay, this is a lot to unpack.
We've covered prisons, knowledge, sexuality, even the role of the intellectual, all through the lens of power.
And we're just getting started.
We've only just scratched the surface of Foucault's ideas.
But hopefully, we've given you a taste of how his work can help us understand the complex ways that power operates in our everyday lives. My brain is definitely doing backflips right now, but in a good way.
It's like he is giving us a new set of lenses to view the world, one that reveals the often invisible forces that shape our thoughts, our actions, even our desires.
And that's incredibly empowering. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Michel Foucault.
We're exploring how power, often hidden in plain sight, shapes so much of our lives.
It's like that feeling when you walk into a store and suddenly remember all the things you're not supposed to do.
Don't touch, no running, and definitely don't even think about shoplifting.
Foucault would say those unspoken rules, those subtle cues in our environment, are all part of how power operates.
It's not just about someone telling you what to do. It's about creating spaces where you police your own behavior.
It's giving very, don't make me turn this car around energy, but for like society as a whole.
And speaking of spaces,
I noticed Foucault also talked about the connection between power and geography.
it seems like a strange pair, but I have a feeling he found a way to connect the dots. He did, and it's brilliant.
Foucault argued that the way we organize space, from prisons and schools to entire cities, isn't neutral.
It reflects and reinforces power relations.
Think about it. Who gets to decide where things are built? Who has access to certain spaces? And who's excluded?
So like those exclusive clubs with velvet ropes and a line of people waiting to get in.
That's spatial power in action.
Exactly.
But it goes even deeper than that.
Foucault uses the example of 17th century travelogues.
These books were filled with stories of exotic lands and fantastical creatures.
Almost like early sci-fi.
Sounds like a fun way to escape reality for a bit.
Oh, they were popular. But Foucault points out something fascinating. These tales often concealed military and economic intelligence.
While they entertained, they also served as tools for colonial expansion, masked as harmless adventure stories. Talk of hidden agendas.
They were mapping the world, sure.
But they were also mapping power, claiming territory, and establishing control under the guise of exploration.
Precisely.
And this dynamic isn't just a relic of the past.
Foucault saw it happening in modern society, too.
Think about how gated communities, surveillance systems, even the design of public parks can encourage or discourage certain behaviors.
It's like we're always navigating these invisible boundaries.
It makes you wonder, who's drawing the lines and who benefits from them?
Exactly the questions Foucault wants us to ask.
Even something as seemingly objective as a map is a product of power.
The borders we draw, the names we use, even the way we choose to represent space, it all reflects and reinforces certain power dynamics.
So that seemingly harmless map hanging in a classroom is actually a tool for shaping how we understand the world, often without us even realizing it.
Precisely.
It's a reminder that knowledge, even when it seems purely factual, is never neutral. Okay, so we've gone from prisons to Instagram to travelogues and maps, and in each one, Foucault sees power at play.
But there's another thread I'm noticing. This idea of norms.
The unspoken rules about what's considered normal and abnormal.
It seems like Foucault is really interested in how these norms are created and enforced, especially when it comes to things like mental illness. You're right, the concept of normality fascinated Foucault.
He saw it as a powerful tool for social control, arguing that institutions like psychiatry and the legal system don't just punish those who break the rules.
They actually play a role in defining what those rules are in the first place.
So it's not just about enforcing the lines.
It's about deciding where to draw them in the first place, exactly.
And he was particularly interested in how these categories of madness, criminality, and deviance shifted and changed over time.
Showing they weren't fixed truths, but products of specific historical and social contexts.
So give me an example.
How did those categories shift in a way that reveals this hidden power dynamic? He talks about the rise of homicidal mania as a diagnosis in 19th century France.
This label was used to explain violent acts.
Especially when the perpetrator didn't seem to have a clear motive.
So instead of saying, we don't understand why this person acted this way,
They created a new category to explain it.
exactly. Foucault argued that this new diagnosis of homicidal mania wasn't just a neutral medical observation.
It served a very specific function within the power dynamics of the legal system.
Because even if they didn't understand the motive, they could still punish the person by saying they were suffering from this mania.
Precisely.
It allowed the system to maintain order and control, even when faced with behavior that didn't fit neatly into their existing categories.
And this highlights how these categories of normality and abnormality aren't just about individual behavior.
They're about maintaining social order, justifying the use of power, and reinforcing the authority of institutions. This is making me think about how we talk about mental health today.
The categories have changed, but there's still this power dynamic at play. Who gets to decide what's normal, what's healthy, and who needs to be fixed? That's a great observation.
Foucault's work encourages us to be critical of these categories.
To ask who benefits from them and who might be marginalized or excluded as a result.
It's about questioning everything, even those things that seem like common sense or objective truths.
Because often, those are the areas where power is operating most effectively, shaping our understanding of the world without us even realizing it.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the mind of Michel Foucault.
We've been uncovering how power operates in subtle, often invisible ways, shaping our thoughts, our actions, even our very identities.
And we've seen how Foucault challenges us to look beyond the obvious, to question the assumptions that underlie our understanding of the world. It's like he's saying, don't take anything at face value.
But that leaves us with a question. How do we actually use this knowledge?
How can we apply Foucault's ideas to the challenges we face today?
That's the real challenge, and one that Foucault wouldn't offer a simple answer to.
He'd encourage you to look at the specific power dynamics in your own life, to think critically about how they're shaping your experiences. So it's not just about understanding these power structures.
It's about being aware of how they're affecting us personally. Precisely.
Take his work on sexuality, for example.
He argued that the very categories we use to understand our sexual identities, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, are themselves products of power.
So he's not saying these categories are meaningless, but that we should be aware of how they were created and how they're used to shape our understanding of ourselves and others.
Exactly.
Foucault would want you to ask, how did these categories come to be?
Who benefits from them and who is marginalized or excluded as a result?
It's like those categories aren't just descriptive, they're also prescriptive.
They tell us not only who we are, but also who we should be. And that's the point.
Foucault would say that true liberation comes from questioning these categories.
From recognizing their limitations and from imagining new ways of being that go beyond the confines of these predefined identities.
So it's not just about fighting for equality within existing power structures,
but about challenging the very foundations of those structures and imagining new possibilities.
Exactly.
Foucault was deeply skeptical of any system that claimed to offer a universal truth or a singular path to liberation.
He believed that real change happens when we start questioning the truths we've been told and creating new spaces for knowledge, freedom, and self-expression.
That's a pretty radical vision.
It's not about overthrowing one power structure and replacing it with another, but about constantly challenging, questioning, and reimagining the ways power operates in our lives. And that's why Foucault's work remains so relevant today.
He offers us a toolkit for critical thinking, a way of seeing the world that allows us to recognize the subtle workings of power and to resist those forces that seek to limit our freedom our knowledge, and our potential.
So what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive into Foucault's work?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to question everything.
Question the assumptions you hold, the categories you use, the systems you inhabit.
Because the more you question, the more you see, and the more you see, the more empowered you are to create change.
That's a great note to end on.
Question everything, challenge assumptions, and never stop learning.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the work of Michel Foucault.
We hope it's left you feeling inspired, challenged, and maybe just a little bit more aware of the complex power dynamics that shape our world.